Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The official death toll from the Ebola outbreak in West Africa has topped 5,000, with another 14,000 stricken with Ebola. The World Health Organization says there are signs infections have slowed overall in Liberia and in Guinea, while the outbreak in Sierra Leone is only getting worse. UN envoy David Mabaro discussed the mixed picture.
The signs are that in parts of West Africa where the elements are put in place, where communities are fully involved in the response, there is a slowing of the outbreak, fewer cases appearing each week. And that's, I think, a real source of inspiration. But there are other parts of Liberia, Sierra Leone and Guinea where transmission is still fierce, where there are many new cases emerging each day.
Here in the United States, the Obama administration went before Congress Wednesday to seek approval for $6.2 billion in emergency funding to contain Ebola. Health and Human Services Secretary Sylvia Matthews Burwell said the U.S. is ramping up training of medical personnel.
To date, more than 250,000 healthcare personnel have been trained by the CDC and the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, doctors, nurses, EMTs, fire departments. But we need to continue this training and make sure that the training is getting through.
The Obama administration has endorsed a proposal that would give partial debt relief to 3 countries worst hit by Ebola. In a statement, Treasury Secretary Jack Lew said the International Monetary Fund should forgive around $100 million in debt held by Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone, about 1/3 of the total they collectively owe. A new report, meanwhile, says the 3 Ebola-stricken countries have lost more money to corporate tax dodging than they spend on public health. According to Action Aid, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea lost an estimated $287.6 million through corporate tax dodging in 2011, while spending just $237 million on health care. An African Union report earlier this year found tax dodging cost the continent up to $60 billion each year. The family of Thomas Eric Duncan, the Liberian national who became the only person to die of Ebola in the United States, has reached a settlement with a hospital that mishandled his care. Duncan, who was uninsured, was initially sent home from Dallas Presbyterian despite suffering from a high temperature and telling a nurse he'd recently visited West Africa. Duncan's nephew, Josephus Weeks, says a foundation will be established in his uncle's name to support respect for African life and the promotion of better treatment.
This deal we reached is an outstanding deal, and we have a foundation that needs our support, and everyone here can do your part. Africa and Africans are not a virus. We made a mistake and we lost one, but we can save 1,000. That's my goal. I can never replace Thomas Eric Duncan, but what I can do is to make sure that everything that happens from here makes it better for everybody else.
The settlement in Dallas comes as nurses across the country have held a one-day strike to protest what they call the inadequate protection of health workers treating patients hospitalized over Ebola. National Nurses United says hospitals still lack proper equipment and protocols weeks after a pair of Dallas nurses contracted the disease from Thomas Eric Duncan. Wednesday's protests included a rally outside Congress in Washington.
We know that Ebola has already reached our soil. We know that other epidemics may reach our soil, so we want nurses to be protected. The best way to protect our community is to protect our nurses.
The UN Security Council has met over the conflict in Ukraine following renewed violence threatening a 2-month-old truce. The separatist stronghold of Donetsk has seen its heaviest shelling since pro-Russian rebels and the government in Kiev reached a ceasefire in September. NATO is accusing Russia of a major military escalation inside Ukraine, sending tanks, weaponry, and combat troops across the border. Addressing the Security Council, U.S. Ambassador Samantha Power said Russia's violating its commitments.
The question is what we, the international community, will seek to do to prevent yet another frozen conflict in Europe manufactured by Russia. The Minsk agreement was brokered under the auspices of the international community. As such, there must be consequences when Russia flouts the commitments it made and continues to destabilize its neighbor.
The opposition-backed Free Syrian Army has rejected a UN proposal to halt fighting in the besieged city of Aleppo. The plan laid out by Staffan de Mistura would allow for the delivery of humanitarian aid and the potential launch of wider peace talks between the rebels and the regime of Bashar al-Assad. Speaking at the UN, de Mistura outlined some potential steps.
The need for focusing on the real threat of terrorism as defined by the resolution of the Security Council. Second is to reduce violence, and I'll come back to that one. The three, through the reduction of violence, try to reach as many people as possible in Syria and outside Syria who've been suffering from this ongoing conflict, and through that, hopefully facilitate it and use it as a block in the direction of building block of a political solution.
UN Special Envoy to Syria de Mistura says the regime of Bashar al-Assad has shown constructive interest. But speaking to Al Jazeera, a commander with the Free Syrian Army rejected the UN truce offer, saying it will only strengthen Assad. A truce in Aleppo between government forces and rebels could help thwart an advance by the Islamic State, which has already attacked nearby opposition areas. New figures, meanwhile, show U.S.-led airstrikes in Syria have killed at least 865 people since they began nearly 2 months ago. The toll includes nearly 750 Islamic State fighters and 50 civilians. The British-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says the actual number could be much higher. Israel's approved a new round of illegal settlement construction in East Jerusalem. On Wednesday, the Israeli government authorized the building of some 200 new homes in the Arab neighborhood of Ramat. The move comes amidst continued unrest in Israel and the occupied West Bank over Jerusalem and its holy sites. In Washington, State Department spokesperson Jen Psaki said the U.S. is deeply concerned by the decision.
We are deeply concerned by this decision, particularly given the tense situation in Jerusalem, as well as the unequivocal and unanimous position of the United States and others in the international community opposing such construction in East Jerusalem. These decisions to expand construction have the potential to exacerbate this difficult situation on the ground, and they will not contribute to efforts to reduce the tensions.
President Obama is in Burma today, the second stop of his Asia tour and his second trip to the country in 2 years. Obama's 3-day visit comes amidst a renewed crackdown by the ruling junta on journalists and dissidents and continued repression of Muslims in the western state of Rakhine. 6 of the world's largest banks have been fined a collective $4.3 billion for manipulating the foreign exchange market. HSBC, Royal Bank of Scotland, JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, UBS AG, and Bank of America were found to be negligent in traders' collusion around global currency. Martin Wheatley of Britain's Financial Conduct Authority unveiled the penalties.
The traders put their own interests ahead of their customers. They manipulated the market, or attempted to manipulate the market, and abused the trust, I think, of the public and certainly us as regulators. The bank's failures to establish adequate systems and controls are what allowed the traders to manipulate the fixed rates across the world's largest currencies, and failings like this seriously undermine confidence in the market and undermine the attempts to genuinely reform banking culture.
New figures show U.S. police forces were responsible for their highest number of shooting deaths in 20 years. According to the FBI, police across the United States fatally shot 461 people last year. The news comes as the family of Michael Brown appears before a UN panel in Geneva investigating the U.S. record on torture. Brown family attorney Darrell Parks called for reforming U.S. law enforcement towards community policing.
Our call today is that we ought to crowd and say that Michael Brown Jr. deserves justice, number one. Number two, that Michael Brown Jr.'s life mattered. That's the call. And number three, that there has to be something done as it relates to policing in our country, a serious look at it. And I think that process is starting, and I want to encourage our government to make a stance that they continue to be very pro for proper community policing, maybe a proper community police commission to make sure that we have the proper things that take place in our communities.
Meanwhile, in Missouri, the grand jury in the Michael Brown case will hear testimony today from the forensic pathologist who performed a private autopsy on the teenager's body. The autopsy by Michael Baden found that Brown was shot at least 6 times, including twice in the head. 2 generic drug manufacturers have been subpoenaed in a federal probe into price hikes. The Justice Department is seeking information from the 2 firms on their interactions with competitors. Generic drugs have seen a major price jump over the past year. A medication for congestive heart failure, digoxin, now costs over $1 per pill, up from just 11 cents 2 years ago. The price for an antibiotic brand went from $20 a bottle last fall to over $1,800 today. Independent Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont has submitted questions to 14 pharmaceutical companies ahead of a Senate hearing on generic drug pricing next week. The British group Reprieve has revealed the U.S. has made secret compensation payments to the families of 2 Yemeni civilians mistakenly killed in a drone strike. A relative of the victims, Faisal bin Ali Jaber, was given a bag containing $100,000 at a meeting with Yemeni officials. The U.S. has made the payments despite never publicly confirming its responsibility for the killings, nor issuing an apology. And the activist and former death row prisoner Darby Tillis has died of an apparent aneurysm at the age of 71. Tillis was sentenced to death in Illinois in 1979 for the murder of a hot dog stand employee. He was freed in 1987 after new evidence emerged, and 14 years later he became one of the first death row prisoners to be exonerated. On September 21, 2011, just hours before the execution of Troy Anthony Davis in Georgia, Darby Tillis came on Democracy Now! And spoke about his commitment to abolishing the death penalty.
I was released from death row. I was not free of death row, and I never will be free of death row.
What do you mean?
Death row lives in me, and this is why I'm here today. I will always continue, as long as there's a man anywhere on death row, to fight for the abolishment.
Darby Tillis died in a Chicago hospital over the weekend. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world.